Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Wolfson. Thank you for coming. As most of you will know, this is the college's 50th anniversary. And although by Cambridge standards that's quite junior, we think it's a really big deal. And we're celebrating it. And one of the ways we are celebrating it is by commissioning a special series of lectures in which we ask Wolfson people to reflect on what's happened in their specialised fields in the years that the college has been in existence. This is the first of these lectures. It's been given by Professor Conor Gearty, who was a student at Wolfson in the 80s and is now a very distinguished academic lawyer and a practicing barrister. But the really nice news is that we also have here today the Chancellor of the University, Lord Sainsbury, who happens to be the visitor with a capital V of the college. And so he has been walking around inspecting his bailiwick, perhaps. And I'm delighted to be able to say that he's also going to introduce our speaker. So, Lord Sainsbury.
Ladies and gentlemen, when I was told about being visitor to a number of colleges, I asked what this involved. And it turns out that all it involves is if there's a complete breakdown in the governance of the college, I am called in to sort it out. And when people told me this, they said, doesn't happen very often. And if it does anyway, you can appoint a lawyer to do it for you. And I thought this was rather disappointing. I thought that actually it would be a rather nice job to come into a college in a kind of sleepy snail-like way when it's totally broken down and sort it out. You haven't yet produced that for me, and I think the next best thing probably to do is to come and introduce a brilliant lecture at the university, at the college. So I'm delighted to be here this evening to introduce the speaker at Wolfson's inaugural 50th anniversary lecture. I'm delighted particularly because the college was founded at a time when the university was right just at the beginning of what turned out to be a period of radical change, which has enabled it to maintain its position as one of the great universities of the world. And because I think the college has played a major role in that exciting process of change. From the start, the college has focused on postgraduate students, which, of course, as you know, with postdoctoral researchers are the foot soldiers of research and scholarship. It's had men and women as both students and fellows from the beginning, and it's been very international, with the majority of its students coming from abroad. And, of course, it's been very egalitarian also. Right from the start, there was no high table at Wolfson, with all the social spaces being shared with all members of the college. Today, that may not seem like radical moves, but I'd left as an undergraduate just before the college was founded, and if someone had said there would be a new college founded on those principles, I would have thought it was indeed very radical indeed. In its first 50 years, Wolfson, I think, has flourished and grown to the point where it's now the largest graduate college in the university. And as you know, to celebrate its first half century, it's planned a large number of events, academic and social. And it's also raised a major fundraising drive with the goal of greatly enhancing the support it can give to its students. I think another admirable move. Among the celebratory activities is a series of major lectures in which Wolfson people reflect on what has happened in their particular field of interest or expertise over the half century that the college has been in existence. The lectures, for some doubt, no doubt, really excellent reason, are actually each limited to precisely 50 minutes. But frankly, from my point of view, if the speaker wants to go on a bit longer, I would be perfectly happy for this to take place. I don't think the 50 minutes should be seen as an absolutely logical restriction on his speech. I'm delighted to welcome you here today for the first of these lectures. It will be given by Professor Conor Gearty, who, as you've heard, was a graduate student in Wolfson between 1980 and 1981. He's now Professor of Human Rights Law and Director of the Institute for Public Affairs at the London School of Economics. He's a Fellow also of the British Academy and a practicing barrister at Matrix Chambers. His subject is the evolution of human rights law over the last 50 years. And as a distinguished academic and as a practitioner, I can think of no one better to give Wolfson's inaugural 50th anniversary lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. I'm tempted to cause a crisis. I think what you said at the start was a plea for some situation that you had to manage. So what I've decided to do is take the cue from the Chancellor and to extend the talk. I myself share Mr. Castro's view that 50 minutes is a mere introduction. And I wanted to test that for some time, and I now have authority. And that will both combine a response to the polite suggestion of the Chancellor. You'll have noticed that he hadn't heard me before. People who've heard me tend to regard 50 minutes as on the long side, with the delivery to him of the crisis that will require the hiring of a lawyer. No doubt a lawyer from Matrix Chambers. So everybody will be extremely happy. The lecture is ending on human rights, but starts with related subjects of race relations and security. And the title of the lecture, which has appeared in the publicity you've had, is "But Still the Days Seem the Same." Now I'll allow that "but still the days seem the same" to percolate in for those of you who regard yourselves as connoisseurs of popular music in the 1960s and 1970s. And the subtitle is "Law and Social Change in Britain, 1965 to 2015. And I'm going to mention some about Wolfson at the start and then carry through the themes. Here goes the lecture. He is so original and brash. Let's take a flyer. So said Shel Talmy, remembering the decision to book a then entirely unknown David Bowie into some studio sessions to produce a few demonstration songs. That was the summer of 1965. And David Bowie was not yet even David Bowie. He was David Jones, rather like University College, Cambridge. In fact, I know it's a painful link. Another original and brash idea that was given its head in 1965. The name change to Wolfson came in 1973, and we should, I suppose, parenthetically acknowledge that it was the result of a tremendous benefaction from the Wolfson Foundation. But by then, David Bowie was already David Bowie and a star, and as you will all immediately noticed, of course, it is from one of his greatest songs, Changes, that I've obtained my title for this evening's celebratory lecture. But still the days seem the same. So has change made a difference? Is the sub-theme of the lecture. But before I get to that, we should pause. The Chancellor has referred to it, and John is an embodiment of it, but we should pause to just try and recall how original, how brash this college was in 1965. No high table. You know, the other colleges, there might be a tiny little step, but it's a high table. Graduate students integrated into college life. Graduate students normally are marooned in some shed 16 miles from Cambridge. I have a tendency to exaggerate. fellows drawn from the university community rather than homegrown chaps with good table manners. Women in the student body was bad enough, but among the fellows too. When I started teaching in another college, I remember undergraduates from another college, still another college, should be nameless, arriving with black armbands because in their college women were being admitted. I got an array of, if I may call them this, little boys with gowns and black armbands. And I know I'm old, but I'm not that old. And you know, we just pause to acknowledge the fact that we have a founding fellow still alive, Professor Mary Hesse. A founding fellow, remains happily with us 50 years on. The students here clearly still experience today what thrilled me when I shut up from Ireland all those years ago. For me, it was the accidental meetings with the kind of people I'd never encountered before and who would have been hidden from me in a less brash place. The Raymond Listers, I don't know if you remember him, Peter and Fiona Plantagenet Somerset Fry. Mary Hesse herself, Owen Chadwick had a connection with the place. The compelling Dr. Hugh Plummer, his house is over there, but some of you may not remember him, a founding fellow, I think, whose mind was poured out to his listeners with democratic energy every lunchtime. Other people were moving in other directions. What a guy. And the extraordinary visitors from around the world, Henry West's development course, producing in this place on a regular basis the most remarkable men and women from around the world. Bill Lubino, a regular visitor, Charles Carlton, the press fellows, such as Judy McGregor from New Zealand, I think. Jack King's police officers, I remember all of Jack King's course. And the place was a cacophony of energetic, kaleidoscopic and deeply knowledgeable noise. And I should acknowledge too, it's where I met my late wife, Diane Wales, a member of the college, sadly no longer with us. So it was a fantastic place to be a student. It was incredible to come here. I hadn't an idea of what Cambridge would hold, but I didn't think it would hold this. Now, none of this seems to have changed about Wolfson College. How has the world around us? The 4 lines that follow, the ones that make up my title, but still the days seem the same, go like this. I'm not going to try and sing it. I haven't asked John to put in some gizmo which produces a song, but it's relevant to the talk. And these children that you spit on, as they try to change their worlds, are immune to your consultations. They're quite aware of what they're going through. And then changes, turn and face the strange. Don't tell them to grow up and out of it. These children spit on you as they try to change their worlds, are immune to your consultations. Well, the changes that were to transform our world had begun in 1965. And what I'm going to do this evening is to reflect on some of the ways, I've slightly anticipated this, in which law has changed over the past 50 years, not just in its content, but also in how it connects to our culture and our society. At the back of my mind, brimming to the surface at regular intervals, will be the question of whether there has truly been any change at all. Repeating so you get it. Or is it merely a repositioning of ancient assumptions? Do the days still seem the same? There are 3 topics I want in particular to explore, all linked to human rights, and therefore all reflecting the broader question of the development of human rights. 3, racial discrimination, national security, and then the human rights law. Racial discrimination first. Surely this is the one where change is most obvious. When Wolfson College was founded, in the lifetime of many of us, the adult lifetime of some of us, it was perfectly possible to deny African, Indian, Pakistani, and of course Irish people, among others, access to services solely on account of their ethnic origins. Now, much is being made today by judges and conservative commentators of the wonderful strengths of the English common law. So it is worth pausing to recall that the common law's ethical commitment to freedom of contract was such that at the time it strongly defended such racialist practices. After all, it had been as recently as 1959 that the owner of the Scala Ballroom in Wolverhampton, Michael Wade, had been able lawfully to impose a colour bar on access to his premises. The union challenged it, which is how it got to court. The court upheld the lawfulness of this at common law. The ballroom felt able to issue the following statement justifying its action. Before anyone condemns us, they should ask themselves whether they are genuinely sincere. They could ask themselves what they would do if, on calling at the Scala to collect a teenage daughter, she could be seen dancing with a coloured man employed as a labourer. We must acknowledge that there is prejudice, and when it is overcome, coloured people will be admitted. Well, as we know, it has been overcome. The Musicians' Union took an early and courageous stand. The Labour Party echoed it, and in 1965, the year of the foundation of this college, had the opportunity which it took to enact the first ever race relations bill, steered through the House by the father of a colleague of mine at LSE, Frank Susskiss. It was a narrow-run thing. I read the debates in second reading the other week. The Conservative Party strongly opposed the measure and very nearly defeated it by a wrecking amendment. The Tory leading the assault was Sir Peter Thornycroft, who was concerned about introducing criminal sanctions into a field more appropriate to conciliation. Even more seriously to the Conservatives, the issue went beyond the question, I'm quoting, of race and colour, quoting still, it touched on matters concerned with the freedom of speech. Now, these remarks were being made by a Tory Liberal, no less, to justify the freedom to make racist remarks and to act in an explicitly racist way, backed by the common law. Fortunately, Sir Frank, leading for Labour, and his colleagues in the Yes lobby were, to quote David Bowie again, immune to these consultations. 50 years on, not even Nigel Farage, although I think probably many of his own members, Sir Geoffrey Bloom comes to mind, though no longer a member, I think, but not even Nigel Farage would get away with opposing the Race Relations Bill of 1965. The legislation has grown over the years and is now deeply embedded in UK law, covering far more than was originally thought possible. Gender discrimination and disability discrimination laws have followed in their wake, supported by European Union law, of course. So has action on discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation, and recently, in certain circumstances, even obesity. Decision on the 18th of December 2014, the European Court of Justice. Under the influence of EU and European human rights law, UK law has been remoulded so as to prohibit a range of conduct in a way that would have been unthinkable to Sir Peter Thornycroft and his friends. There is now even a special law, which I hanker after studying, if I had the time, the Local Government Act 2000 Part 3, which is devoted to ensuring that councillors behave themselves in what its enemies would call a politically correct way. An extraordinary and neglected measure. As old class conflict, still prominent in the mid-1960s, has fallen away, so has identity politics, with its belief in the transforming power of legal regulation, come to take its place as a key driver of social and political change. We have an Equality and Human Rights Commission, successor to, among other bodies, the Race Relations Board, to ensure that our laws on discrimination across the board are properly applied. Big change there, an unparalleled human good, surely, to quote, of course, the great E.P. Thompson about the law. On the whole, yes, undoubtedly. But identity has a dark side, which has of late been percolating to the surface of our culture with increasing determination, even venom. The problem about someone being heard for the first time, from whichever group they are, is that those used to talking are bound to think that they are being too noisy. As these previous silent minorities have been growing in confidence in the spaces carved out for them in law, asserting their right to equal treatment, so have some elements of the majority, the usual takers and talkers, that is, seen this as a challenge to a traditionally dominant position that some of them at least have no desire or inclination to surrender. The problem is exacerbated when those in the dominant community see their own living standards fall, their influence declining, their affluence declining with their influence. What about we indigenous people? As Nick Griffin, sometime leader of the British National Party, used to put it, parroting the language of human rights as a counterpoint to the agitation of the minorities by which he believed himself to be surrounded. Well, Griffin has long since to be a political force and was indeed recently expelled from his own party. Well, according to the newspapers, he's backing Nigel Farage at the next election. And as we all know these days, the Farages drive Conservative policy in a way that would have appalled David Susskiss and his Labour colleagues back in Frank Susskiss. I mixed him up with his son. Frank Susskiss and his Labour colleagues back in 1965. Griffin is now more mainstream than he ever was when he seemed to threaten the political establishment. Well, let's look at what this means in a practical way. 1 month ago, just before Christmas, the government issued a consultation paper on the duty that it is to fall on specified authorities, quote, to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. The consultation paper is a result of a proposed statutory obligation on specified authorities to be found in the counter-terrorism bill currently going through Parliament, the Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill. This statutory development is the latest in a long line of efforts by successive administrations to tackle the issue of violent extremism. It started under Labour with a short policy document called Contest in 2006, and which now, with the enactment of this latest bill imminent, will have statutory backing. Before this bill, the coalition government's version of the policy had already, in a crucial and important way, expanded to reach not just violent extremism, but extremism. That was a shift made by Mr. Cameron on foot of a pretty disturbing Munich speech that some of you may remember. Having an inclination to or propensity for violence is no longer required to attract the attentions of the state. Being extremist is enough. This, according to the paper, can create, quote, an atmosphere conducive to terrorism and can popularize views which terrorists exploit. So, what is an extremist? The government tells us, here's the definition of an extremist: vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. We also include, in our definition of extremism, calls for the death of members of our armed forces. Paragraph 5, quoting from Prevent 2011. there are two ironies here. One is the resilience of Britain's imperial delusions. Universal values are really, on closer inspection, British values. Democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, they're British, not universal. Because, I assume this is the case, we still rule the world culturally, if not militarily. And second irony, free speech is so important, we need to stop speech, which challenges the assumption about free speech. McCarthyism, by the way, worked on exactly the same principle. Democracy is so important, we have to stop challenges to it. With these new laws now soon to be in place, with this new statutory duty on public authorities, and with the bloody impetus of Paris behind all this, it may be that this assertion of our values against the outsiders, and in particular, in a way I'll defend, our Muslims, will become increasingly difficult to resist. And we should be clear who are the targets of this policy. If there had been any doubt, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government's letter to British Muslims earlier this week, vocally supported by the Prime Minister, would have made this clear. The letter asks them to, quote, explain and demonstrate how faith in Islam can be part of British identity. Of course, there are one or two references in the consultation paper to extreme right-wing groups and so on. The thugs of the EDL is what Mr. Pickles calls them in his letter, just as with the fascists in the 1930s and during the Cold War, there were some references to these people. But these people are our people, guilty of taking our values too seriously, not citizen foreigners with different values altogether. They're thrown in as ballast in an argument rooted in the question asked by the Secretary of State of the Muslim people. Are they for us? Prove it. We are told in the consultation, quote, the most significant of these terrorist threats is currently from Al-Qaeda associated groups and from other terrorist organizations in Syria and Iraq. But of course, there's a lot of stuff about Africa as well. Islamist extremists create a narrative of them and us, which includes, quote, the uncompromising belief that people cannot be both Muslim and British, and that Muslims living here should not participate in our democracy. That's the kind of extremism the consultation paper believes it has to root out. And they have to be rooted out, even if, and here repeating the point in a vital change from Labour, they have to be rooted out even if they've never said a violent thing in their lives. Now, pausing with the Chancellor here and other people from the university, there is a specific point of great concern to the universities. I'm glad to say the British Academy has just issued a statement on this. Consultation requires all relevant authorities to, quote, demonstrate an awareness and understanding of the risk of radicalisation in their area, institution or body. Systems need to be put in place, information shared, training agreed. The Home Office is to monitor and oversee this. There are to be inspections, local authorities, schools, after-school clubs, preschool clubs are going to be visited and checked to see whether the preschool kids are displaying British values. Doctors, hospitals, the prisons, probation service, all included, all have to produce big schemes to show that they're on the lookout for these extremists. But it's the universities and colleges of higher education that get most attention. 10 pages out of 38. Now, in the language of this paper, free speech becomes, quote, a platform for drawing people into terrorism, end quote. The answer is for the universities, quote, to exclude those promoting extremist views that support or are conducive to terrorism. There are detailed orders handed down with regard to organising events. Some universities apparently are very good because they have danger commissions. Other universities are going to have to learn. We're going to have to meet and decide whether the people we've asked to speak at the university support British values enough to be let speak. The coalition that began life as the destroyer of quangos has become a deeply bureaucratic big brother. Now, we should be clear what's going on here. Terrorism itself is defined in the Terrorism Act 2000 in a way that goes way beyond actual violence to embrace what is close to direct action in pursuit of a political cause. But this latest law does not even require the minimalist control of a threat of terrorism to clamp down on extremism. Attacking British values will be extremism. Now, what is really going on, I said? Of course, this will not mean that every critical studies course will close. Nor does it mean that all sociology lecturers that are any good will have to be reported to the authorities. I don't think, Chancellor, it even means that at this point, in a month's time, you'd have to get up here and remove me. I don't think it means that, but that would be a little bit of a crisis. Do you want to try it now? That would get you in a spot of trouble. You'd have your thrill then. We traditional critics, I think, will be fine. We'll be okay. I mightn't have been okay 20 years ago if I talked about the military occupation of Northern Ireland. Might have been in a bit of trouble then. But we'll be okay now. We'll be okay now. Free speech will work for us. It is Muslims the document is after. And in particular, those who seek to understand the impact of the colonial and post-colonial powers on Muslim people around the world. Is it extreme to point out the deep hypocrisy of a country that engages in illegal wars against defenseless people around the world while prattling on at home about the importance of democracy, the rule of law, and mutual respect and tolerance? Or to follow the logic of the first article of the International Bill of Rights in 1966 and say that the killing of occupying military forces may sometimes be a sad necessity, but a necessity nonetheless. Or maybe it's only British occupying forces that it is extreme to oppose. We're allowed to kill other soldiers and call for the killing of other soldiers, but not ours. Now, I can say these things, and I won't get into any trouble. But if I were visiting a man, explaining, query, excusing ISIS by talking about my rejection of the agreements that created the countries in the Middle East after the First World War, or if I was a visiting Muslim cleric talking about Gaza, about invasions and mass killings of Palestinian people, there'd be quite a bit of nervous shifting of feet, I'd say. In fact, I probably wouldn't even be here. I don't mean that. I'm talking metaphorically, John. You wouldn't be afraid of it. There'd be a new committee at the university which would turn me down. It wouldn't be worth the trouble. It wouldn't be worth the flack. It wouldn't be worth the deputations. It wouldn't be worth the parliamentary questions. It wouldn't be worth the police visits. This is a new Cold War. Now, there was always a risk that identity politics would be turned into a cultural war, the majority versus the rest. This seems to be what the consultation paper and Mr. Pickles' letter, strongly, as I say, supported by the Prime Minister, aim to incite. If the Conservative Party has its way, the only acceptable Muslim will be either an Uncle Tom defending bogus British values uncritically that fly in the face of all fact, or it'll be a silent Muslim, like the women driven into their homes in France by the criminalisation of their mode of dress. We don't say nigger anymore, we say extremist. Parenthetically, I think it's extraordinarily disappointing that Pickles' fellow minister, Lord Ahmed, signed the letter. In my opinion, he should have resigned, as did the admirable Baroness Warsi in her case over the government's morally indefensible Middle Eastern policy. This takes me to my second topic, security, obviously related to the counterterrorism matter I'm discussing, but changing gear a bit. In the year of Wolfson's foundation, the person who would become its second president in 1980 was a young fellow of Keble College. I'm glad to see, I think I see Sally here in the audience. I see Sally. His wife. He published his first book in 1965 called Not in the Public Interest, a study of what its preface described as, quote, the passion for secrecy to be found in British government at the time, mid-1960s, particularly the civil service and the security service. The final chapter of the book, The Role of the Courts, did not need to be a very long one at the time. In 1965, Crown privilege and judicial deference still rule the roost. Now, since David Williams wrote that book, Foundation of College, over the past 50 years, there's been a dramatic change, just as there was analogously with the race relations stuff. The explosion of judicial review and the vast incursion of courts into the realm of government has been one of the legal wonders of the age, all achieved without recourse to statute, but via the development of the common law's long neglected capacity to hold the executive to account. Now, I'm not talking yet about the impact of direct human rights law. Rather, I have in mind the growth in the realms of natural justice or fairness, where the courts insist on due process, and then the expansion of something called Wednesbury criteria of executive scrutiny, where the courts look at what ministers do and see whether it's profoundly unreasonable, the expansion of all that into means through which you can, by rationality and propriety, control public authorities' decisions. How has all this been done in a way which respects rather than subverts parliamentary sovereignty over the last 50 years? By the simple but brilliant device of reading words into statutes, words that are not there, but the courts presume Parliament to have implicitly included. The doctrine of what is called ultra vires, beyond powers, allows the courts to present as the servants of Parliament in their mastery over the executive. So far from flouting Parliament's will, the courts are doing Parliament's will, the effect of which is to control the executive. How far we've come is very well expressed by Mr. Justice Rabindra Singh, who's here today, I'm glad to see, in a case from July 2012, in which the Child Poverty Action Group was challenging the legality of a strategy the government had announced on the reduction of child poverty. The very nature of the litigant, Child Poverty Action Group, shows you how far judicial review had come. Now more open than it used to be with regard to who could take cases, so-called locus standi. In finding that the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions had not established the Child Poverty Commission that the relevant statute required him to do, the statute said, start this. The minister didn't. Ultra vires, Mr. Justice Singh said the executive has no power to make law, save in those circumstances where it is granted power to do so by primary legislation. And then a nice phrase, and this was written before I saw he was going to be here, as has often been observed, the executive enjoys no sovereignty. Further quote, the new government may have good reason, this is important, to adopt a different policy from that of the previous government. However, in Mr. Justice Singh's judgment, they are not entitled as a matter of law to ignore or fail to comply with primary legislation as laid down by Parliament itself. Now, the strength of the judicial position revealed here, a distillation of 50 years of advance, necessarily entails two weaknesses, not in the argument, but in the nature of the argument, which is nothing to do with the person saying it, but it's the structure. First, the courts must buckle before clear parliamentary intent. So Parliament, if it makes it impossible to avoid, can do it at once. And, of course, that intent, more often than not, is crudely imposed by the executive via its control of the legislature. Our legal framework is based on a kind of myth, which is that we can divide Parliament and the executive. Well, mostly we can't, and the executive can ram stuff through. And then we're a bit stuck with our doctrine of ultra vires. Secondly, where this happens, the courts have no power to reach beyond the words they find in the statute before them to express any view, critical or otherwise, on policy. Mr. Justice Singh was absolutely right. We can't critique the policies because we don't like them and turn that into unlawfulness. The government of the country, quoting again, enjoys no power to make law. It does have a legitimate right to make policy and to exercise its powers in the public interest as it perceives them to be. It is not for the courts to intrude upon the democratic process, and government policy on issues of political controversy is the very stuff of democratic debate. So the courts can do their thing, but they buckle before executive control of Parliament, and they cannot question the policy that drives that control and shapes the law that results from it. So we may all be citizens of the law's empire today, but the passion for secrecy identified by David Williams has not gone away. Rather, it has taken a legal shape. That's the point about this second of my three themes. It's no longer the prerogative, it's no longer sort of in the margins on the penumbras, it's taken a legal shape. Our spies still use atrocity as a reason for increasing their powers, but they do it now via legislation rather than by covert initiatives, camouflaging their aggrandizement with parliamentary fig leaves, a secret committee here, a private briefing there, a compliant Malcolm Rifkind everywhere. I think he should be preserved as a national treasure, a reminder to us all of the dangers of parliamentary accountability. Judges have unwisely, I have to say, allowed themselves to be drawn into this new national security edifice, taking on monitoring posts without having the capacity or the power to do a proper job. Entire criminal trials now threaten to be held in secret, due not to some ancient government prerogative critiqued by David Williams or a D notice which has been uncovered by the press, but on account of the clear and unavoidable provisions of the Justice and Security Act 2013. This is not what David Williams expected 50 years ago when he ended his book with a call for greater parliamentary involvement in national security, so as to achieve that, quote, informed public opinion, which was, in his view, quote, the essential element in a country which claims to be democratic. The secrecy remains the same. It's just shifted its frame. And that's even the case despite the Freedom of Information Act. So should the courts do more? Well, it is tempting to say that they should, that the judges should burst through the self-denying controls of ultra vires and condemn not only illegality, but policies behind laws that are so bad, so destructive of human rights and the rule of law, that their legislative outgrowths should be declared unlawful, even when they are to be found in primary legislation. Some judges have, in recent years, toyed with the assertion of such a power, striking down parliamentary acts for egregious breaches of the rule of law or human rights. I think we should be very careful before we dispense with Mr. Justice Singh's careful distinction between policy and legality, between legislative and executive acts. There are some things that only politics can remedy. Even the Human Rights Act, 1998, refuses this option, going to great pains to preserve, in my opinion rightly, parliamentary sovereignty, even against human rights abuses. Sometimes the Prime Minister says that the Human Rights Act forces him to act to change legislation. It doesn't. It just makes it up in order to be able to criticise it. The Human Rights Act preserves parliamentary sovereignty. The most that it allows the courts to do, where they are faced with a parliamentary act that they can do nothing with, an interpretation that they can deploy no magic and ultra vires to undermine, is issue what's called a declaration of incompatibility, which is an unenforceable declaration of a breach of human rights. You may remember the Belmarsh detention case, where the House of Lords, as was then our Supreme Court, issued a declaration of incompatibility about the detention of suspected foreign terrorists on the basis it was discriminatory to pick only foreigners. That did not lead to the release of those people from Belmarsh prison. They stayed in Belmarsh prison. It put political pressure on the executive to act, and the executive, through Parliament, did, to its credit in due course, act. This takes me to my conclusion via my final grand change query, the rise of human rights law. To some extent, all of what I've been talking about is, as anticipated by the Chancellor, the rise of human rights law. Race relations law is a kind of subset of human rights law. National security is a challenge to human rights law. And now we have human rights law itself. At the end of 1965, Wolfson had, I suppose, just begun. December this happened. The Labour administration of Harold Wilson announced that it would allow the right of individual petition before the European Commission on Human Rights, and thereby permit individuals to access the European Court of Human Rights via the Commission at the time, in cases where they could plausibly argue that they were victims of human rights abuses. This was a very big deal at the time. The European Convention on Human Rights had been agreed in 1950, had entered into force in 1953, and Britain had, in common with a number of other countries, not let its own people take its government to Strasbourg. And this was the concession that was made by Labour at the end of 1965. It came into effect in 1966. The French didn't do it until 1981, so it was at the time not a unique political response to human rights. So the British were in the middle. Germans and Irish much earlier, Belgians earlier, Britain in 66. The next 3 decades saw not just the growth of ultra vires and the growth of judicial review, which I've referred to, but an upsurge in cases in Strasbourg, where the court and the commission, now superseded by the court, were. A succession of victories over the United Kingdom government for prisoners, persons with mental disabilities, the media, terrorist suspects and their families, and many others. All this legal energy culminated in the new Labour pledge of 1996 to bring rights home, duly delivered in the shape of the Human Rights Act, passed in 1998 and brought into effect fully in October 2000. This measure finally allowed the arguments being put before the European Court of Human Rights to be directly made before the local courts as well, albeit, crucially, repeating it without challenging parliamentary sovereignty. The Strasbourg Court doesn't challenge parliamentary sovereignty either. It rules in a way that creates an international obligation on the UK government to implement its decisions. The government chooses how to implement, and if the government refuses to implement, it's in breach of its international obligations. It does not mean, as we've seen with regard to recent cases in the Supreme Court and elsewhere involving prisoners, that anybody has a locus within the domestic courts to rely on a Strasbourg court to resist some action by the state which has not been, which is made possible because they've refused to follow a European court case. It is wrong to say that we are therefore beholden to Strasbourg with regard to Parliament. We have freedom of action subject to international law, and it's also simply wrong to say that the British courts have to follow European Court of Human Rights cases. Section 2 of the Human Rights Act is explicit that they need only take them into account. Misinformation from the very highest levels of government, the purpose of which is to create conflict where no conflict exists in order to look better by resolving the issue. Surely here, there is a change that is bedded down. Human rights law, 1998. A refutation of David Boy's assumption that the days remain the same? Well, as I've anticipated, sadly no. The debate about human rights today could easily have been had in 1965. The hostility of the Conservative Party and UKIP, the ill-informed distaste for abroad that underpins so much discussion in this area, the nostalgia for a common law past that, as we have seen, included its dark side. Indeed, that dark side may be the quiet appeal to many on that side of the political divide. Exactly the same points could be made writ large about a huge change that I have not talked about this evening: the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union, similarly attacked by many who would undo the changes wrought by regional cooperation over the past 30 years. So what we see in the course of the next 4 or 5 years is a choice about whether to return to the past with regard to both repeal of the Human Rights Act, which is Conservative Party policy, albeit their promise to publish a bill before Christmas has not, so far as I know, been met. We wait for the Conservative Party's Human Rights Repeal Bill. They are insisting that the rest of the world adhere to human rights, and that the only part of the world which should not have human rights is the one bit of the world for which they are responsible. They have to work out the logic of that. We'll see what happens. And there is, of course, the question of a referendum on the European Union. So the next few years could shape the answer to the question of whether things have changed in the field of human rights. The penultimate word in this lecture, it's about 50 minutes. How many do I have left, Mr. Norton? About 2? 2. I might come in right on the button, unless I witter on boasting about it. I leave the penultimate word to the current President of the Supreme Court, Lloyd Neuberger, who observed of Britain in a speech in Cambridge almost exactly a year ago, February 2014. I thought it was extraordinarily perceptive and rather brave of the President of a court to get behind the skin of his subject. This is what he said: "The transformation from a global preeminent status to just one of many EU or Council members requires," he said, "an almost superhuman attitudinal adjustment. This country needs a superhuman attitudinal adjustment to cope with its relatively low-grade unimportance. And to mask this, we pretend that universal values are British values. We try, as James Meek brilliantly argued in the London Review of Books, some of the few pages in that magazine not occupied by the President of Wolfson College, that was a disturbingly warm laugh from all of them, wasn't it? Brilliantly argued that the whole thrust of security policy is to stay friendly with the Americans, so that somehow or other this country can maintain an empire illusion through the management of another country. And the rejection of all the kinds of Europes are all of a piece. There are factions within the country, large factions and powerful factions, allied to powerful commercial interests that are not prepared to make the almost superhuman attitudinal adjustment. The last word, David Boy. I am a bit of a fan. I didn't mention Roger Federer, though. That's pretty good. Oh, there he goes. David Boy, still original, still brash. His latest album, Nothing Has Changed. So perhaps not true of the past 50 years in law, but more true than perhaps we expect or think. Thank you very much.